Yeah, good evening, folks. I'm Scott Lane with the San Antonio Valley Science Association. We're here to welcome you. So Ed doesn't get on me, let's open with prayer. And then I will go through some housekeeping details and some business before we start tonight's program. Let's pray. Lord God, forgive us for our sins and put us in proper fellowship with you. Allow the Holy Spirit to lead tonight. Protect us from all sorts of things going on, and let us focus upon your word and your world tonight. We ask for your help. We say amen to that. Amen. Tonight's program is Earth Battles. How old is it? Volume 1, The Grand Canyon. This is the second in the series of programs we're going through from Evidence Press. And I think most people liked the program last month, although they thought it was a little dense or a little quick for them. We'll see what your evaluation is of tonight's program.
Last month was from the same people.
Last month was from the same people. Next month and the next 2 months are from the same people if we choose to.
Not exactly.
Huh?
Not exactly. The Dead Sea Scrolls is kind of ancient.
No, Dead Sea Scrolls is July.
Always in July, okay.
Because next month we have universe battles. Tonight's we had, excuse me, I didn't erase March, I should have. Tonight is, I got that out of order.
No, you got it. It's fine.
It's fine. We're April, not March.
Yeah, April's fine.
You just should have
Well,
deleted
we're
the
not
top
doing
line.
universe battles, we're doing Earth battles.
Oh, okay.
I recopied that out of order.
Oh.
Scramble there.
So, invert April and May. Earth battles is tonight, universe battles is next month. Testing evolution is in June. And I do have that DVD, all right, which I don't think you have. And then we have the Dead Sea Scrolls program. And then we just figured out that in August we'll be doing a program from Genesis Apologetics called Genesis Impact. Is that right? Yeah. Genesis Impact, which is a drama. A lot like God's Not Dead. Carl saw it in debate, but it is very good, and I know that organization is very happy with it. Okay. Prayer concerns. Please pray for the relief of the world from COVID. Thanks for the vaccine's arrival. Heal our nation from civil unrest and violence in our cities. Pray that our nation heals and comes together. And pray for protection of the First Amendment and religious freedom. We're still better off than some places, folks. Did you see what happened to a church in Canada this week? They arrested the pastor, and then they chained up his door and put barbed wire around the church to keep him out before they let him out.
Oh, good.
But it's only for his own good.
It's only for his own good, yeah. Please pray for all of that. There are hard copies of the communique back there, as well as people receiving it online. Is there anybody here who signed up to get it electronically last month? Last month. No, I can't check on that tonight. I will check on that, though. The major article in there is which arguments should not be used by creationists. There's so much material there of things people use that they probably shouldn't use, because we've got better arguments, better data, and some of it's just flat wrong. If you're a creationist and you're touting that the earth is flat, please don't. You're laughing. They're still flat earth society. And either those people are real crazy, or they're part of a joke that just keeps going. But
See that girl up there?
yeah, but if a creationist does stuff like that, people are just looking for stuff to find lack of credibility on us. And we need to stay away from that. That article goes into that.
Well, I think there's an important point there, because nobody's actually trying to shut down the Flat Earth Society, but they are trying to shut down us, because they know they don't have to shut down the Flat Earth they know people won't take it seriously.
Yeah. While you're talking of things shut down, let's talk about something opening up. The ICR Discovery Center will open May 4 in Dallas. It is a world-class museum and Earth and Science History Museum. And we recommend that going to check out that over $30 million facility that's in Dallas that will reopen May 4. We also have our Genesis commentary. All of this, again, is by hard copy, or hopefully you're getting it by email. If you're not getting it by email and you wish to, the sign-up sheet is back there. Come on in, ma'am, and sit where you wish.
Volunteer.
Please do remember that we have our radio program, Believing the Bible, available every Saturday at 1:45 on KSLR, AM 630. You can see a list of the programs that start with this Saturday with Jim Benderwald from Evidence Press, who's the head of the organization of the video that we're going to see tonight for the next 2 months after this.
Is he gonna talk about people in battles?
Let's see. Yes.
He leads the discussion.
Yes. Earth Battles is actually what he's going to talk about on 5-1. If you take a look at that. And on 417, we had him talking about testing evolution, which was actually the first documentary they did. We will be adding to this and have a summer schedule up by the end of the month. Right now, we've done 2 programs with Dr. Robert Carter from Creation Ministries International on biology. This Saturday, we got a marathon session. How many skits do we have at this point?
Probably 5.
We've got 5 skits, and we've got a 15-minute interview with Ken Ham. So we put all those together, and that'll give us enough programs to get through the summer.
Okay.
Is he gonna comment?
Otherwise, it's really tough to come up with one you don't know.
On what?
Is he gonna comment on the skits? Is he gonna engage?
No.
You haven't invited him to engage on the skits?
His time is controlled. We have to call him at 9:45 CST, and he got a special time to do that because he's got something later in the afternoon. I tried to set him up for two interviews. We can only do one. So, but again, they do remember our radio program. That is on podcast. So if at any time you missed it on 1:45 on Saturdays, you can just simply go to the KSLR website, go to the KSLR podcast, and all of our radio programs are on there and can be listened to at any time. Let's see, I think that that's all I've got for
Scott?
pre-business. Yes?
Can I interject about 5-1, May 1st?
Uh-huh.
We're having a citywide election, you know. Just don't forget to vote, please.
What are we
Early
voting?
voting,
Mayor?
on the mayor.
Ah,
That's right, you're not in San Antonio, so you don't care.
yeah.
The
San
mayor.
Antonio, what's that?
Well, other parts are voting on their mayors as well.
Yeah,
And
Mayor
also,
and city council are coming up,
Yeah.
May 1 vote.
yes,
Well,
and a
That's a
proposition
That's a
about,
Saturday, and so there's voting on a Saturday.
Yeah.
Well, there's early voting starting before that,
on Monday the 19th.
but the first is the official last day of voting.
Thank you for that plug, and not only vote, folks, but get informed on what's going on.
Yeah, this is a quick question. Is there anybody on the ballot that you feel good about voting for?
Huh?
I had a question for the Williams. Is there anybody on the ballot that you feel good about?
I can't understand you,
For
sir.
the mayor.
Which candidate would we recommend for mayor?
We are not going to go there.
Ask me later.
My question was, is there anybody that you feel good about voting for? I wasn't asking who that was. I was just asking if there wasn't.
It's the same thing. Rose is still a rose by any other name. Talk to Cindy
Well, I'm
later.
not asking for a name. I'm just wondering if they're all bad or if there's any good ones.
Yes, yes, there's some good ones.
There are some.
Let me say this about the 2 people in San Antonio that are running.
3. There are 3.
There's 2 main candidates. Of the two main candidates, there's a real difference, and they're both interesting characters. Okay? So,
Like
but again, educate yourself, because their positions are out there. And you've already seen the product of the current mayor.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm not going to downplay that because there's some things he's done well. Anything else in terms of business we need to handle before going? Thank you for reminding people about that because I didn't even remember.
Well,
Because it's not being well publicized.
no, and their signs are being taken down. No.
Yep. All right. Let's go for earth battles.
Cindy, in the local paper that they put out on a weekly basis, there's a list of all the voting locations in it, so that I know that in my local, we got it, because I took a look at it, it's got a total list throughout San Antonio, and so.
Have you ever been to the Grand Canyon? Have you ever hiked down into the canyon and gazed around at the vivid layers and rocks? A friend and I did just that when we hiked down the Grand Canyon's South Kaibab Trail to Cedar Ridge. It was a hike I will never forget. I'm Jim Benderwald, the Director of Evidence Press. Our purpose was to document the observable evidence and ask, does the evidence better support long ages, or does it better support the biblical flood model? This documentary exclusively interviews Christian creationists who see the evidence clearly supportive of the biblical flood model. Adam Huff from Canyon Ministries was our tour guide who I interviewed as we hiked down the trail. In addition, our interviews with two esteemed exploration geologists, Dr. Andrew Snelling and Dr. John Whitmore. I also interviewed Canyon Ministries Director John Elbert and Crying Rocks Ministry Director Guy Forsyth. All these people provide insight into the canyon and specific pieces of evidence helping to understand the biblical flood model. In addition, we had our graphic artist produce an animated visualization of the flood, and Dr. Snelling provided his expert description of the flood as told in the Bible. I was happy to discover that the evidence for the biblical flood is profound and plentiful. So I can plainly say the evidence is crystal clear that the flood was worldwide, it was catastrophic in nature, and the evidence is fully consistent with the flood having occurred about 4,500 years ago, as the biblical genealogies leave us to believe. Welcome to Earth Battles. How old is it?
Make for yourself an ark of gopher wood. You shall make the ark with runes, and shall cover it inside and out with pitch. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on the same day all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were opened.
In the Genesis account of the flood, the fountains of the great deep are mentioned first in chapter 7, verse 11, when they are opened or broken up, and then in chapter 8 when they are closed. And we have to look at the Hebrew there. The great deep, in most Hebraists will say that's referring to the deep ocean waters, but others will say it also includes the deep earth. And both fit the situation. We know today that there's even still fountains on the ocean floor with water coming out of cracks in the ocean floor. And it makes sense that the Earth's crust, the pre-flood Earth, was broken up at the time of the flood, and water came out from inside the Earth. And the scientists tell us even today that locked up in minerals inside the Earth's mantle, hundreds of miles down, there are water molecules. And they released when the rock becomes molten. And that's why up to 70% or more of what comes out of volcanoes is water in the form of steam. And so that description in Genesis, the Genesis account of the flood, is very apt in describing water bursting out from inside the earth through cracks all around the globe. And it was in the form of superheated water or steam that flashed into the atmosphere, and that created the moisture in the atmosphere that then fell as rain, because it says the fountains of the great deep were broke open and the windows of heaven were open. Water cascaded back to the earth as a result of the water coming out from inside the earth.
And the water prevailed more and more upon the earth, so that all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. The water prevailed 15 cubits higher, and the mountains were covered.
The Genesis account is quite clear. There are chronological markers and details there so that we know how long the flood was happening. It's all related to the years of Noah's life. And we're told on a specific day of the month, and a specific month, 600th year of Noah's life, the fountains of the great deep broke open. And it says the rain was on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. So there's this first 40-day period of intense activity when there was the fountains and the rainfall on a global torrential scale. And then we're told that the waters prevailed exceedingly until all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered, so that by the 150th day, the ark was floating on a global ocean. And it was at least 15 cubits clear. That's 15 cubits, this arm length here, clear of the highest pre-flood peaks. Now, we have to remember that Mount Everest wasn't there before the flood. It's made up of flood sediments, and so we don't have to have waters as high as Mount Everest. Only sufficient to cover the mountains that were there in the pre-flood world. And then we're told the fountains closed, the windows were closed, the rain started to taper off, and the water started to retreat or peak.
Also, the fountains of the deep and the floodgates of the sky were closed, and the rain from the sky was restrained, and the water receded steadily from the earth, and at the end of 150 days the water decreased.
And at that point, the ark landed on the mountains of Ararat. Not Mount Ararat, but the mountains of Ararat. Now, we don't know whether the water came down or whether the mountains of Ararat were pushed up to meet the ark. Whatever. The point is, the Bible specifically says that the ark landed on the mountains of Ararat.
And in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark rested upon the mountains of Ararat.
And from that point onward, we know that the waters were assuaged. That's the Old English term, but it means that they started to retreat. And they retreated into deeper new ocean basins that were being formed as a result of all the tectonic, the earth movements during the flood. And so we're told over the next 7-8 months, over 200 odd days, the waters retreated, and then we're told that Noah did certain tests by sending birds out, because he couldn't see beyond the horizon whether there was dry land, but the birds could fly out and find if there was dry land, and if they didn't come back, he knew that they would have landed somewhere and been quite happy out there. But even then, after the birds didn't come back, God got Noah to wait another 57 days, and that's probably to allow vegetation to start growing so that the animals, when they got off the ark, would have food to eat. And it was 371 days, or 370 days, on the 371st day after the flood began, that God let Noah open the door and come out. So it was just over a year. And there was those progressive slow stages of retreat of the flood waters, and that would have also resulted in the waters eroding off some of the sediments that had been formed during the flood and depositing it off the continental shelves. Lots was still happening in the latter part of the flood, even though the waters had peaked about day 150.
In the 600th year of Noah's life, all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were opened. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place which thou didst establish for them. A year after the flood began, and the dove came to him toward evening, and behold, in her beak was a freshly picked olive leaf. So Noah knew that the water was abated from the earth.
Well, let's look at a showcase for evidence for the flood. And the reason we go to the Grand Canyon is not only because it's well exposed to view, but it's well studied, and it's like a showpiece in the conventional scientific community for all these layers supposedly taking millions of years. It's not just in the Grand Canyon itself we see the layers, but if you go north through Zion up to Bryce, you're actually going through up another 10,000 feet of layers. So there's about a 3-mile thickness of layers, and of course, some of those layers aren't where the Grand Canyon is. They've been eroded away, and they're only exposed further north, and what is called the Grand Staircase, because there's a set of cliffs. And then, of course, the canyon is carved into those layers, and the top of the Grand Canyon is part of the Colorado Plateau. So you've got this uplifted area, and the headwaters of the Colorado River at a lower elevation than the top of the plateau. So water didn't flow uphill if it was going to carve out the Grand Canyon. I often remember the first time I went to the canyon where I was looking at the sign which said, you know, millions of years of slow erosion of the Colorado River carved out this Grand Canyon. And there was a little boy there with his mother. He was probably about 9 or 10, and he started laughing. And his mother said, "What are you laughing for?" He said, "You mean to say that little trickle of water down there carved out this big canyon?" And it didn't make sense to him. And it doesn't make sense to me either, because every year I take people down the Colorado River and we go on rafts and we go over rapids. Now those rapids are formed by debris coming from the side canyons and filling in the Grand Canyon. And the Colorado River, even in John Wesley Powell's time, some of these rapids are the same as John Wesley Powell went over in 1869. And so floods in the Colorado River haven't been able to clear out the debris that's filling up the canyon. So if the Colorado River isn't powerful enough to clean out the debris, how on earth could it have carved out the canyon itself?
Yeah, so Grand Canyon is spectacular. And when we really understand the full scope of Grand Canyon, it helps us, I believe, process more rightly what was involved in forming Grand Canyon and its relationship to the flood. You know, Grand Canyon is 277 miles long, and that's measured by the Colorado River running through the Kaibab Plateau. So the Colorado River starts in Rocky Mountain National Park, ends in the Sea of Cortez of the Gulf of California, 1,456 miles. 277 miles of the Colorado River is known as Grand Canyon. And it's sandwiched between these two huge man-made structures. To the northeast, you've got the Glen Canyon Dam, which creates Lake Powell on the Arizona-Utah border. And then you've got, you know, the Hoover Dam that creates Lake Mead kind of over by Vegas. And Grand Canyon, boom, sandwiched in between. So you've got this massive, really long canyon that also averages about 10 miles wide. The widest part of Grand Canyon is 18 miles wide. But it averages about 10 miles wide. It averages about a mile deep, so 5,280 feet deep. But the deepest part of Grand Canyon is roughly right around 6,100 feet. I mean, this is massive. The river, as it flows through Grand Canyon, averages 300 feet wide. That's the length of a football field. So if you've ever stood at the rim of Grand Canyon and looked down, people think it's this little ribbon, it's this little trickle down there. But, I mean, we're talking a length of a football field wide on average. And the average is 25, 30 feet deep. There's places over 150 feet deep in this thing. I mean, this is a geological feature, right? I mean, this is big time. And but what's intriguing about it as well is it's not just this slice in the earth. It's not like if you took a sharp scalpel and just kind of slowly drag across and have a nice, you know, straight cut. I mean, this is ripped through the Kaibab Plateau. And so it is this network of canyons that are just nonstop exploring, these side canyons that feed down into, you know, and those are huge. Some of them are miles long, you know, I mean, 10s and 20 miles long. I mean, they're big, big side canyons, and they're 3/4 to a mile deep themselves, you know, as they're feeding into this. And so you've got this whole network throughout the Southwest on this edge of the Colorado Plateau that's just been torn through. And then you connect the other canyons of the area of the Colorado Plateau, like Bryce Canyon and Zion Canyon and Arches and all of these different canyons of the area. And we've got this massive event that was taking place in this area, and it's fascinating. So it brings it to a place where there's just nonstop adventure as you constantly exploring all of these different side canyons, whether it be hiking or rafting or whatever the case may be. But it is, we need people to recognize it's not just a little slice of the earth. It is a massive network of canyons with a huge Grand Canyon going down the middle.
We're heading west to Grand Canyon, Mount St. Helens, Yellowstone, Black what mine?
Black Thunder Coal Mine.
Black Thunder Coal Mine.
That's right. This is Jim and Larry. We're heading west. We're going to Grand Canyon. We're getting started, so it'll be quite an adventure. We look forward to what we can show you in rocks and layers and a little bit of frivolity along the way. So stay tuned.
Go west.
Okay, going west.
Okay, we are finally at the Grand Canyon, and we're about ready to get started. I'm here with our tour guide, Adam Huff. Thank you, Adam, for doing this tour with us. Going to appreciate it a lot.
And then we are going to be heading down the South Kaibab, and about how far do we go?
Sure, we're going to go about 1.5 miles down the trail this morning.
Okay. Now the weather for today is not too bad. It's only about a high of 85, something like that.
Correct, yeah. It's going to be a beautiful day.
What would you expect that we're going to see as we head down?
Sure. As we go down about 1.5 miles, we're going to drop around 1,100 feet in elevation. We will pass through 4 different stratigraphic layers of sediment, limestone and sandstone as we go down.
Okay. All right. Cool. Well, we're about ready to catch our bus and head over to the trailhead. So thank you. You'll see more of us as we travel the trail. So we made it almost down to Ooh-Ah Point, and we have some cross-bedding here that Adam's going to tell us about. And so go ahead,
yes,
Adam.
So we've come down into a layer called the Coconino Sandstone, which is known for something called cross-bedding. And that's referring to these angled lines that we see. And we see a few different angles right here. But we have these lines all throughout the Coconino Sandstone. And those lines are the remnants of sand dunes. When these little individual grains of sand were carried in and deposited, it was swept along and formed sand dunes. And you've seen pictures of sand dunes in a desert, I'm sure. And from a conventional geology perspective, they see these cross-bedded lines, and they see that as evidence of a desert environment rather than an underwater environment. But from a creationist perspective, we see this as powerful evidence of an underwater environment. And why two completely different viewpoints? Well, again, they see the crossbeds and see that as a desert environment, but Dr. John Whitmore from Cedarville University, a well-known creation scientist, has done an extensive amount of research on this Coconino Sandstone. And he has come in and discovered a lot of evidence that confirms this was laid down by water. And the primary piece of evidence has to do with the angle of these lines.
Okay.
Well, he has come in and measured this angle in hundreds of places throughout the canyon.
Right.
And what does he find? Nothing greater than 25 degrees. It's all less than that.
Amazing.
Which
Okay.
all is confirming that
Right.
this sand was laid down in an underwater environment.
Now we had some people walking by, and I think you mentioned it as well, is that it just makes sense that if this is sand, that it would have been formed and solidified by water.
Yeah, so there's a process called lithification where the sand grains cement together. Okay. When I think of a sand dune in a desert environment with the wind blowing that sand around, it's going to disturb all that sand and mix it up very quickly.
As we look at the rock record, for example, I'm interested in Coconino Sandstone. And I don't think any of the experiments that have been done so far in the history of sedimentology have shown us exactly how that sand was laid down. I think that there must have been very fast-moving water. There must have been a lot of sand in that water, and probably conditions that we've not encountered in the laboratory or in real-life situations as well. So I think we have a little bit of ways to go before we can completely understand some of the processes that would have happened during the flood. It's certainly not a simple explanation. So I've often seen, people shake up a jar of mud and sand and so forth and let it settle out quickly, or even slowly for the mud particles, and they think maybe that's how the flood sediments were made and how all rocks were made. But that's not true at all. The flood waters, in most cases, were probably moving very quickly, carrying huge volumes of sediment, and probably produced rocks that we haven't yet duplicated in the flume studies yet today.
The following interview with Guy Forsyth is out of place because it was recorded a day later in Sedona, Arizona. However, Guy's discovery was in the Coconino Sandstone, and it demonstrates the powerful evidence that the Coconino Sandstone layer was laid down in an event that involved massive amounts of water as described in the biblical flood model. Looking at Guy's evidence, we can see that wind over millions of years could not produce sedimentary layers like you're about to see. So we've made it to Sedona, Arizona, and I'm here with Guy Forsyth. He is extremely knowledgeable of this area. He hikes the hills extensively, and he's a discoverer of something very special. Tell us about that, Guy.
Okay. What it is parabolic recumbent folds. And what it amounts to is you have wet sediment that gets bent while it's still wet, so it makes a nice curve rather than having the flat line that you normally see with strata. And with a parabolic recumbent fold, it is where the material has been folded in the shape of a parabola, but it's recumbent, it's laying on its side. So that makes it a parabolic recumbent fold. And I found about 25 outcrops of these in Sedona, and they are very special because they indicate that the material had to be deposited very, very rapidly. Okay, where the naturalists will tell you that the white rock that you see behind us here, the coconino, was deposited as sandstone. Of course, we believe it was deposited during Noah's flood, and it was done very rapidly, and these folds confirm that. And the reason they confirm it is because of the way they're made. Anytime you have cross-bedding, this slope, it comes from this way and slopes down. So you always know what direction it came from just by looking at which direction it sloped. We have the top of the bed, the bottom of the bed. We've deposited a layer of material, and in the case of the fold that's behind us, it's 20 feet thick, one bed that's 20 feet thick. And then while that sediment is still wet, above this top of the bed comes another sediment flow, and it literally grabs the material and folds it over. And that tells us that that 20 feet that has that dip had to be deposited. And it had to be soft. And it had to be recently deposited because the next one has to happen very quickly. The next one comes across and folds it. You have 30 feet of deposition in, let's say, a minute or 2 minutes. So it's pretty significant. And I found 25 of these outcrops around Sedona.
Pretty cool. Thank you, Guy.
Okay, thank you.
So we've made it almost all the way down to Cedar Ridge, and Adam is going to show us some fossil trackways.
Yes, so what we have here is a piece of the Coconino sandstone. It's actually sheared off, it's broken, and it's fallen down and landed here to where it's at. And we see some fossil trackways. Now what that means is we're seeing fossils not of an animal, but of the footprints left behind by that animal. And if you look closely, you can see some of them. Here's a really good one right there. And you see an entire set of footprints that's moving this direction. But what's fascinating about it is you can look at the footprints, and you can look at the way the sand is impressed in by its foot. What we see here is a sand dune that this creature is trying to climb up. But it's not climbing this way, the direction that these footprints are moving. It's climbing this way. This was uphill. This rock has fallen in such a way that what was uphill is facing down at the moment. It's trying to climb up a sand dune like this. Why do its footprints move sideways? It's because there is a water current that is pushing that creature to the side. It's literally trying to escape this inundation of water and sand that is bearing it. It's some sort of amphibious creature. It's underwater, but it's trying to get out of this inundation of sand and water, right? And once again, it's confirmation that this happened in a water environment. If this was in a desert with loose sand being blown around by the wind, if you had wind strong enough to blow an animal this size, I don't know, maybe the size of a cat or something, that'd take a strong wind to blow him sideways. That would just obliterate these footprints. You wouldn't have them preserved like this. But this creature is walking in wet sand, so he makes an impression into the sand, and that quickly gets covered with more sand that preserves it. And then many years later, it shears off, exposing these trackways for us to see.
Pretty amazing. Very cool.
Paleontologists have really done a lot of study in this area, in an area called taphonomy. It's the study of what happens to dead things. It could be trees or leaves or bugs or shrimp or, a number of other things. And in every case, the consensus is that it doesn't matter what the water temperature is. It really doesn't matter how much oxygen is there, if you have a lot of oxygen or no oxygen. It doesn't really matter on water depth. If you have an organism, those organisms will decompose. And God has really made it that way for organisms to decompose so the nutrients can be recycled and so on. Otherwise, we'd be piled up with dead things, all over the place. But when you find organisms in rocks, that means that those rocks have formed quickly. There is no other way around it. And I think most paleontologists who understand the subject will freely admit that fossils are evidence of rapid formation of that rock. The conundrum they have is that if you can't put the time within the rocks, where are you going to put the time? And so geologists are now more frequently putting the time in between the layers of rock, not within the layers of rock, because they realize fossils really do mean that the rocks have formed quickly. So then you can have a whole discussion on, is there evidence for the time in between the layers? And oftentimes that is hard to come by as well. And so for me, fossils are exciting because they tell us that the rock record was made catastrophically.
Fossils are an interesting creature, so to speak, right? I mean, fossilization is fairly rare today. And, you know, because in order for something to become a fossil, it requires some kind of specific circumstances. You know, if something dies and just lays on the ground, it's going to decompose, or it's going to get eaten. It's certainly not going to become a fossil. And so it's got to be put away in a safe place where it's not going to decompose, it's not going to get eaten by those scavengers. And really, quite honestly, the best way to do that is rapid burial. And so that it just doesn't have that opportunity. And so we've got these layers of sediment filled with fossils all over our entire world. And so what we're seeing today, the process that we're seeing today, the lack of really new fossils that happens all that very often today, can't answer how do we get all that. Something different had to have happened in the past. And it's pointing dramatically toward the reality of that biblical account of a global flood being true. And again, if then that global event is an accurate account of our past, and we have this destructive, really plate tectonic geological catastrophe with water aftermath that completely reworked our Earth, then those millions and billions of years really start to go away. And so what we're seeing there in Grand Canyon is just is loud, quite loud. And it's fun to be able to help people to see that.
We finally made it down to Cedar Ridge, and I want to show you some things. Down here, Adam's going to show us the red wall limestone.
Yeah, we're a mile and a half down the trail. We're well below the rim, but still much further below us is the red wall limestone. It's that sheer cliff, and it's the tallest sheer cliff we see in the Grand Canyon, roughly 750 feet or so, of red-colored limestone. And one of the really neat things we see in the red wall limestone is the nautiloid bed you're familiar with. And what's interesting is that these nautiloids largely are pointing in the same direction, an indicator of a watery catastrophe that has washed these creatures. They're not all in the same direction, but some of them are vertical and some of them are at angles that also indicate a lot of water moving quickly that is carrying these creatures along and burying them as it goes.
One of the interesting fossils in the Grand Canyon, a little bit larger than most of the smaller corals and clams, are what we call nautiloids. Everyone's familiar with today's paper nautilus, the coral nautilus. Well, these fossils were straight-shelled nautiluses. They were cigar-shaped, and had a head like a squid, and they grew all their lives because they kept on adding chambers. They only lived in the last of the chamber, but they grew long chambers. Now, in the Grand Canyon, halfway down the walls of the Grand Canyon, is a rock unit called the red wall limestone. Now, limestone's easy to understand. Lime turned to stone is limestone. But why red wall? Well, because when you stand at the rim of the Grand Canyon and you see the cliff of this limestone, it actually sits up there like a red wall. So geologists are quite simple. They attach names like that to rock units. Now, the conventional wisdom is that the red wall limestone formed in a calm and placid sea over millions of years as lime grain by lime grain fell and animals died and were fell to the bottom and were slowly covered up over millions of years. Well, these nautiloid fossils are significant because they debunk that idea completely. They're found towards the bottom of the red wall limestone in a layer, a particular band called the Whitmore nautiloid bed. It's about 3 meters thick. It varies, about 10 feet thick. It varies in different parts of the canyon. And these fossils were first noticed in one of the side canyons in the upper Grand Canyon area. We call it Marble Canyon.
And there wasn't a lot of interest in them until biblical geologists start to go in there and look at them, and looked at the extent of them. And so over the years, Steve Austin and others, as part of the same research team, went from outcrop to outcrop, because it's difficult to find these outcrops in the walls of the Grand Canyon. I remember going with him below Havasu Falls in the Havasupai village and the canyon there, and sure enough we found them right by the ladder where everybody goes down from one bench to another. The nautiloid fossils are right there, and we can trace these nautiloid fossils from the eastern Grand Canyon right through the canyon, all the way beyond the suburbs of Las Vegas, up near St. George in the Virgin River Gorge, up into Utah, an area of something like 12,000 square miles. And it's a vast layout. Everywhere we go, at every outcrop, we find about one or two every 10 square feet. And so if you do the math, you're talking about billions of these nautiloids in this layer. Now, they're different sizes. There's small ones, medium-sized ones, and large ones, you know. Some that are about a foot long, others that are 6 feet long. As we said before, these are creatures that grow all their lives. Think of things like alligators. You know, they're small, and they keep growing. Well, that's the same with these nautiloids. They kept growing all their lives. They got bigger and bigger. So when we find a mixture of small, medium, and large ones buried together, that obviously is children, parents, and grandparents, all buried. So it was a living population over 12,000 square miles, billions of these creatures all buried together. Now, another interesting, and they're all in the one layer. Another interesting feature is that, well, you get other fossils buried with them, but other creatures like clams and corals buried with them, but many of these shells are pointing in the same direction. What's significant about that? Well, when these guys were alive and they were floating and moving around in the water, they're going to align their bodies, the length of their bodies. If they want to go across the current, that's okay, but that, you know, you use a lot of energy to do that. So you generally align in the direction the current flows, and that helps you to get around. Of course, they can regulate what depth they go by how much air they have in their shells, and so it means that if they're all trapped, many of them pointing in the same direction, they're all trapped in the same current. And it would appear that a debris flow came out from the northwest up in Colorado, swept over this area, and this giant school of nautiloids were suddenly ripped away and buried. Now, some of them, of course, have been found standing upright like this. And, of course, a current, a debris flow, tends to cause eddies like this, and so some of them would get knocked up like that, and then they get, as the mud settles, they get, as it were, snap frozen in the mud, sitting up like that. Well, hello, if it was sand grain by sand grain, lime grain by over thousands of millions of years, this guy would have been sitting upright like that for thousands, slowly been waiting to be fossilised. No, that doesn't make any sense. He had to be totally entombed, as it were, snap frozen in this debris flow. As it stopped, everything, all the material settled, and everything trapped in it, whatever position it was in, was immediately settled. And so this nautiloid bed in the Grand Canyon is powerful evidence that the layers themselves were formed very rapidly on a very large scale over very large areas. And so this is very powerful evidence that we like to talk about as evidence for the global flood.
One of the things that we find here at the Grand Canyon, one of the most prominent features that is just so clear, is the fact that the layers are flat.
Yes.
And if you look at mountains, generally mountains, they're peaked. There's peaks all over the place. But as the layers are flat, this would indicate
We had the entire planet covered with water.
evaluate that is slower and a little better to
Yes.
consume than the last DVD.
Yeah, more consumable.
How many people have been to the Grand Canyon? I've been to the West Rim, the South Rim. Very few people have been to the West Rim. I haven't been to the North Rim. I do want to recommend 3 things that were kind of around this film. If you've never been to Sedona, get there. That's in northern Arizona. Beautiful area. The contrast between the orange rock and the green foliage that's there is striking. It's an absolutely beautiful area. And that's something to be said for everything that's across the Midwest there. 2 years ago, I dragged my wife into a vacation. When we went up to Yellowstone, we were there for 2 days before she figured out she was in the middle of a volcano and we had to leave. And then we went through Bryce Canyon, Zion National Park, and the whole bevy of national parks there in Utah. You talk about a laboratory, and we've seen the Grand Canyon along the way. You talk about a laboratory of seeing God's creation in the flood. It's just amazing looking at all of those. Kind of a recap of what you saw. If we're interpreting the evidence correctly, what is the great unconformity at the bottom of the Grand Canyon? And incidentally, we find it all across the world. That is the bottom base rock where everything was shaved off when this huge worldwide flood occurred.
Amen.
And basically what it says is that you had about 2 miles worth of material shaved off from across the face of the planet, which shows you the unbelievable scope of this thing.
It's like how many knows
Huh?
It's like a big tsunami.
I can't hear you, sir.
Like a big tsunami.
Yeah.
But it's a continual tsunami. It's a continual tsunami. And what occurred, the Grand Canyon, when it was first laid down, was not a canyon. It was pure strata all the way up for about 2 miles. Then what happened after 150 days of the flood and the flood water started to recede is you had what we call the Erodozoic period, in which a large amount, there was probably about 2 miles worth of sediment there, and the first mile, the top mile, was shaved off by erosion off the continents. But there was still more than a mile worth of sediment left there. One of the things that occurred after the flood was these huge lakes of water which were trapped when most of the water came off of the continents. Those earthen dams which held back those waters eventually broke. One of them was east of the Grand Canyon. And the Grand Canyon, just like the kids said, just like it's interesting they said that, when I was at the Grand Canyon on the South Rim, there was a docent talking to some kids, and one of the kids says, "You're telling me that that little ribbon down there cut this whole thing?" And he just looked at the docent like, "What drugs are you on?" Because it violates common sense.
Yeah.
Now, if you're going to read millions of years into it, maybe sort of, except there's a couple of problems with that. First off, if Colorado would have had to get to the Grand Canyon, it would have had to climb uphill 1 mile. The last time I checked, water doesn't do that. And what really shows what the Grand Canyon is, and what we have from creation science is, this great earthen set of water, of which the earthen dam broke loose, traveled through and cut it out in a very short period of time. Again, this was a catastrophic event. And everything we find in the Grand Canyon conforms to these creationist viewpoints, and that it happened very recently. Okay, that's a recap of what we have from this film. Any thoughts or questions on this film? Yes, sir.
Psalm 104 doesn't say that it happened at the end of the flood. Psalm 104 says that the Lord lifted up and put down. It doesn't say when. They attach Psalm 104 arbitrarily at the end of the flood and then say this is the scenario. But they've got no evidence for that, and they don't present any evidence for that.
No. There is a little bit of common sense that he fixed a barrier, because that's what it says in the scripture, that he fixed a barrier between the two so that they would not meet again. And so that's why most people associate it with the end of the flood. But no, they don't give a date for it. Yes?
There's a place that's on the northern border of Oregon, right by Washington State. It's out in a flat area. There's no river that runs through it. And there's a canyon. It's not as big as Grand Canyon. It has exactly the same description and features. And finally, someone broke the code on it. And 10,000 years ago, or whenever the ice age was, a huge lake broke free exactly right there and carved that canyon in a matter of days. Same, everything.
Right.
Just smaller scale.
And actually, there's a larger scale event that goes through Washington State and across Montana. Is it Montana or Wyoming at the top? Montana it is. Of a large inland lake broke loose, created a whole flat space in western Montana, and then a set of both carved out spaces as well as canyon going through Washington State. And what's real interesting about that is how much material was collected from that, because this was a huge catastrophe, and we find the debris in the canyon, guess where? Out in the Pacific, which is exactly what we would expect.
Mount St. Helens is also a good perspective.
Yeah. One of the interesting things, you saw Canyon Ministries, which is a great ministry that serves the Grand Canyon area. There are a lot of people that they do this full time in terms of Canyon Ministries. But ICR, the Alpha Omega Institute, and others have visits to the Grand Canyon each summer, which you can sign up for. And again, this is going to sound like a plug because I did Yellowstone, I've done Utah, and I've done the Grand Canyon. You talk about some great vacations with something to see and something to learn, I would recommend it. Paul, the reason I brought that up was Paul Taylor, there at their center just outside of Mount St. Helens, does similar tours of the Mount St. Helens area. So we have two great ministries that are serving those two laboratories for looking at sudden catastrophic creation. Anything else? Yes, sir.
I just want to say I was just visiting there because I was about to permanent with water. And I calculated it at 4 feet by 4 feet, the firmament. If that much water fell on the earth, it would be 1,730,256 billion gallons of water.
Now you're talking about the canopy theory?
Yes.
Okay.
That's
And there'd be a lot of water if there was a canopy up there. Incidentally, I'm going to comment on that in next month's communique because we find that there are some problems with the canopy theory. Just by the fact that you had the upwelling of so much water from the waters of the Great Deep, that you had such heat coming up from that, and so much water vapor spewed into the atmosphere, along with the changes of temperature that would have occurred from all of those aerosols being in the upper atmosphere. And then you had cool continents that came upon it. Guess what's going to happen from that differentiation of heat and water vapor available? You're going to have huge rains. So, I'm not saying there wasn't a canopy, but I'm saying you don't have to have one to have the kind of event we had. Anything else that you want to talk about from this film? Yes, sir.
The time is 12,000 years for creation, and the flood was 6,000 years ago.
Yeah, he has Dr. Harris has a complete timeline of this.
And it works very well. It works better than this.
This is incidentally what's called part 1. They have a part 2 they're working on now. I don't exactly know what, you remember from our discussion what he's going to put in the part 2?
I'm not even sure when it's going to come out. So
Well, I'm not sure what's going to come out either. Just for completeness sake, I'm going to give you a quick whirlwind tour of some of the things that I do when I do a seminar on this topic. Now, one is in the video itself. In the video itself, they do have a 16-minute piece on how to date a rock. Now, how to date a rock? You call it up, ask it out for dinner and dancing. No, that's not it. That's not what Andrew Snelling says in 16 minutes either. But if you want to buy the video and listen to it, you can. One of the nice evidences is that uranium and thorium, which is in our dirt, in our rocks, in our sedimentary rocks, we have them giving up helium as a byproduct. They give up a lot of other things, but helium is one byproduct. If uranium and thorium have been giving up helium for the last 4.5 billion years, what should there be in the top of our atmosphere? A huge storage of helium.
The atmosphere should be mostly helium.
It should be largely helium. And again, we've had that huge helium storage, but it's not there.
Right.
Evolutionists theorize that it's escaping into space. We've now disproved that theory.
It's coming in.
Because we're actually gaining more helium from solar wind than we are losing it to outer space. If you calculate the amount of helium that's in the upper atmosphere that we've now been able to measure, that calculation of how long it would take it with the current amount of deposition from it just floating out of rocks is somewhere between 6,000 and 175,000 years. Nowhere near 4.6 billion. Yep. As I told you, this is going to be a whirlwind tour. I do this in seminar, but we're going to do it quickly for you tonight. Depletion of the Earth's magnetic field. Currently, the Earth's magnetic field, and this is an estimation, decays at a rate of 1 half-life every 1,400 years. That is, 1,400 years ago, it was twice as strong as it is today.
It's twice as much energy.
Twice as much energy. That's a true statement. This has been verified by different measurements of that field over the years, over quite a few years. Now, if we extrapolate back 10,000 years at this rate of depletion, we would have had a magnetic field with the energy of a star. Obviously, it was not ever that strong. But that's just for 10,000 years. Evolutionists theorize that it's cyclical, that it gets stronger and it gets weaker. One small problem with that, science is supposed to be about what we observe. You just saw the chart. In all of our measurements for all of the history of science, what have we observed? It gets weaker. We have never observed this cyclical phenomenon that they are hanging their hats on.
The Chinese have pots with reversed magnetic field.
Well, they have that, and consider what I was doing with that. There are different rocks, not just with pots, where you can demonstrate polarity reversion and different things of that nature. But there are explanations that would go outside of that that would happen even if you had to be true that there is nothing but a reduction in the field. That does not necessarily have to be because the field did get weaker and stronger. That does not necessarily have to be true.
It doesn't have to get weaker or stronger, it can be reversed.
Right.
Reversal doesn't have anything to do with that necessarily.
Ages of comets. Size and frequency of comets are gone within 10,000 years of the solar system formation. If we started with any amount of short period comets, what happens every time they go near the sun? They make their orbits and go near their sun. They boil off a piece of their material. If this solar system were older than 10,000 years old, there should not be any more short period comets. And yet we still find them today. There are many things in your field that we could go into with that.
This is what I've been specializing on for the last 2 months.
Yeah. There's a video back there that talks about 38 different proofs of this solar system showing that it is a young solar system, that it is not ancient.
Excellent video.
Excellent video by Spike Posaris. Coal and oil formation. We have now demonstrated that in a laboratory we can make high-grade coal and oil in 20 minutes using a catalyst, temperature, and pressure.
Yay.
It does not take millions of years. What's worse is, what has also been demonstrated is that the cap rock which holds in oil cannot exist for millions of years. That the upper bound for cap rock to hold before it cracks and gives way to the kind of pressure that oil exerts and natural gas exerts is about 10,000 years. So it cannot be older than that. What happens when you drill down and find oil?
You get rich.
You get rich. That's a true statement. But you also have an explosion of the oil up from the pressure down there. That pressure is being exerted on cap rock at all times. And it shows that that stuff has not been down there that long. I'm going to skip over that. I already made that point.
Can I make another quick
Yes.
statement? Just to give anybody that's wondering about quadrillion gallons of water, if our oceans were to get 1 quadrillion gallons of water, Corpus Christi would be under 290 feet of water.
That'd be excellent.
That's how much, I'll give you an idea how much water that is.
Nickel on the Earth, much of the micrometeoroid and meteoroids that we have hit the Earth have a high nickel content. So if we've been bombarded by these types of meteorites for the past 4.6 billion years, there ought to be a lot of nickel on the face of the Earth. We don't find it on the face of the Earth. So, ooh, wait a minute, there's been rain and erosion, so maybe it all washed into the seas. Well, calculation shows that if this has been going on for 4.6 billion years and it's all washed into the seas, we should have 960 cubic feet of nickel deposited on the bottom of the oceans. You go down and look at the oceans, is it there? No.
No, it's not.
The amount of nickel that we find that is deposited in the oceans, when you calculate it out, calculates out to around 10,000 years. Ocean salinity. One of the things I open most seminars with is, how old do you want the Earth to be? 100 years? I can give you data on 100 years old, even though I know it's not that. You want it to be 1,000 years? I can give you data on that. 4.6 billion, 6,000, 10,000, pick a number. Here's examples of that. Mineral deposits in oceans. According to the evolutionists, our oceans are about 3.5 billion years old. And the stories on how the water got here are weird.
Yes, they are.
But the current salinity level, because our oceans are collecting minerals all the time from the erosion from the continents. The current amount of salinity, salt in our oceans, would be done at the current erosion rates in about 260 million years. But what happens if there was a worldwide flood event about 4,000 years ago, 4,000 to 6,000 years ago? Suddenly you get all that stuff in the oceans. When? Now.
Suddenly.
Suddenly. It doesn't take 260 million years. Aluminum. At the current erosion rates, you'll get aluminum there in just 100 years. It doesn't take 4.6 billion or 3.5 billion. Magnesium would get there in just 45,000 years at current erosion rates. But what happens if there was a flood? It's there immediately. Silicon would get there in just 8,000 years at the current erosion rates. Where's the 3.5 billion? Potassium in 11 million years, copper in 50,000, gold in 560,000, silver in 2,100,000, mercury in 42,000, lead content in the oceans just in 2,000 years, tin in 100,000 years, nickel in 18,000, and all come down to 10K years with a flood included. Yeah, I can give you data for any date you want, but the point is, if you assume a flood, what we see in the oceans testifies to the youth of the earth and what the biblical timeline is.
Could I make this point?
Please quicker.
The smaller the number, the greater the indication that there's something that precipitates that stuff out of the ocean.
Mm-hmm. Rotation of the earth. Earth's rotation is slowing. Currently it's 1,000 miles per hour at the equator. But it is slowing, ever so slowly. At this rate, it should have stopped long ago by evolutionary time scale. Unless what you say is that it was spinning at an unbelievable rate, which would have made the original Earth a pancake.
Yeah.
It never was a pancake. You never put syrup on it. It never came from IHOP. Okay? Recession of the moon. The moon is moving away from us. What's the figure? I think it's about 1.5 inches a year. Something on that nature. We actually have a good measurement of that because of the laser reflector that was left by Apollo 11. We're able to bounce
Several of them.
lasers off of it. At current rates of speed, recession that is moving away from us, the moon would have had to start inside the Earth. It didn't do that. And in point of fact, if it had ever been very close to the Earth, it would have set up such tides that the formation of the early biology would have been impossible. And it would have torn up the Earth. There are a ton of young Earth evidences. Saturn's rings could not have stayed together as they are for 4.5 billion years. Continental erosion. At the current rate of erosion, what should have happened by now to all of the continents? They should all be eroded into the water. It should be a flat Earth with nothing but water. There's the winding problem in the universe with galaxies. Poynting-Robertson effect. That's an effect where the sun, with its tidal forces, should have swept clean. The sun combined with the planets should have swept clean all the debris we see in the solar system, and the solar system should be fairly clean now after 4.6 billion years. But what are we still measuring? Meteors, meteorites, and what we call micrometeoroids. There's a ton of dust out there. There hasn't been the time for this effect to occur. Comet water. The Earth is supposed to have gotten most of its water from comets. The only problem is they have the wrong type of water. Most of them are have a high amount of deuterium.
Not true.
Not true? That used to be said.
And the latest research shows that about half of the comets are rich in deuterium and the other half are not. And the abundance of deuterium does not depend upon whether you're talking about comets with 1,000-year periods or periods much shorter.
Okay. Now, would there ever have been enough comets available to supply us, Mars, Venus, etc., with the type of water contents that we think were collected from these?
Yes, there is. But that's a recent event. A recent event.
A recent event?
Yes.
Okay, we'll discuss that one before I go to the type next month. Topsoil thickness. One of the things that you will find is that when we first got here to America, there was about 30 to 36 inches of topsoil across America. With us uncovering it, with taking the wood off of it and all of that kind of stuff, there's now somewhere in the neighborhood of 12, 18 inches as an average thickness across it. But if you do a calculation, just how does topsoil occur? It's the grinding of rock. It is the walking on. It's the breakdown of rock from water, from rubbing, and from everything else. And if you calculate out the production of 36 inches of topsoil across a continent, guess what? There's that magic number again. You come up with something around 10,000 years. I don't know whether part 2 will get into all that. They had built this as how old is it? And the only thing they really went into, besides the Grand Canyon, which is impressive, and it's all they should have done in one video, was they talked about helium escaping from zircons, which is good evidence. Again, your thoughts before we leave.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, a couple things. I pulled out 2 things tonight by Lanny Johnson. Lanny Johnson is with Alpha Omega Institute. He does 2 great programs for children. Dinosaurs, Cavemen, and the Flood. First person up here to get this one gets it. Creation, Evolution, Design, or Chance. Again, both from Lanny Johnson of AOI. These are the 2 freebies of the night. When we get through, I do invite you to take a look at the materials at the back. On the right-hand side are free materials. On the left-hand side are paid materials. I have been asked at the end of the night that during the time that you look at that, we hold ourselves to about 5 minutes of looking at those materials, and then we ask it, because y'all like to talk, and that's great. I am glad that you fellowship. But we do ask that after about 5 minutes of looking at those materials, that any discussions we have after that, we move outside so that the ladies can clean this area. This church is such a fantastic host for us. And let them go to sleep before midnight. All right? So you can stay in the parking lot as long as you want. But please do move it out. Let's close in prayer. Lord God, thank you for this time together. Thank you for the great evidence for your Bible, for your word, for your truth. Thank you for the great creation you've given us. We're in awe of you. Protect these people as they go home. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.